All right. We shall not dilly, we shall not dally. We're talking about John B. Watson. We're talking about, in part two, his work. The reaction to Watson's program. Now, Watson's attack on the old psychology and his call for a new approach were stirring appeals for many psychologists. Consider his major points. Psychology was to be the science of behavior, not the introspective study of consciousness and a purely objective experimental natural science. Both human and animal behavior would be investigated, and psychologists would discard all mentalistic ideas and terms and use only behavior concepts such as stimulus and response. Psychology's goal, then, would be the prediction and control of behavior. And despite its appeal to some, however, Watson's program was not embraced immediately or universally. At first, behaviorism received relatively little attention in the professional journals. Not until the publication of Watson's 1919 book, Psychology from the Standpoint of a Behaviorist, did the movement begin to have a significant impact. One psychologist who disagreed with Watson was Mary Whitton Calkins. Questioning his rejection of introspection, she spoke for many psychologists who believed that certain psychological processes could be studied only by introspection. The arguments about introspection persisted for many years, and Margaret Washburn went so far as to call Watson an enemy of psychology. Inevitably, support for Watson's movement grew, particularly among younger psychologists, and by the 1920s, universities were offering courses in behaviorism, and the term was becoming acceptable in the professional journals. Among the older psychologists, William McDougall issued a public warning against behaviorism's popularity, and Titchener complained that behaviorism had engulfed the country like a tidal wave. By 1930, however, Watson could proclaim proudly that behaviorism was so important that no university could avoid teaching it. Now, concerning the methods of behaviorism, we have seen that when scientific psychology formally began in Germany, in the old world of Europe, it was eager to ally itself with the older, well-established and more respectable natural science of physics. The new psychology tried to adapt natural science methods to its own needs. This tendency is most obvious with behaviorism. Watson insisted that psychology must restrict itself to the data of the natural sciences, to what could be observed. Psychology, he insisted, must deal only with the objective study of behavior. Only the most stringently objective methods of investigation were acceptable in the behaviorist laboratory. To Watson, these methods included the following. First, behaviorism and the methods of behaviorism included for observation with and without the use of instruments. Second, it involved testing methods. Third, it involves the verbal report method. And fourth, it involves the conditioned reflex method. So, observation is a necessary basis for the other methods. Objective testing methods were already in use at that time, but Watson proposed that test results be treated as samples of behavior rather than indicators of mental qualities. To Watson, a test did not measure intelligence or personality. Instead, it measured the subject's responses to the stimulus situation of taking the test, and nothing more. Verbal report is more controversial. Because Watson so vocally opposed introspection, his use of verbal reporting in the laboratory left him open to criticism. Some psychologists considered it a weak compromise, saying that he let introspection sneak in the back door after throwing it out through the front. Why did he allow verbal reports? Well, despite his aversion to introspection, he could not ignore the work of psychophysicists that used introspection. Therefore, he suggested that speech reactions, because they are objectively observable, are as meaningful for behaviorism as any other type of motor response. Quote, saying is doing, that is behaving, Watson wrote. Speaking overtly or to ourselves, thinking, is just as objective as a type of behavior as baseball. End quote. Nevertheless, the verbal report method in behaviorism was a concession widely challenged. Opponents contended that Watson was playing word games, offering merely a semantic change. Watson countered by agreeing that verbal reports could be imprecise and were not a satisfactory substitute for objective observation. He restricted their use to situations in which they could be verified, such as reporting differences in loudness between tones. Unverifiable verbal reports, such as imageless thoughts or descriptions of feeling states, were ruled out. The conditioned reflex method was adopted by Watson in 1915, 2 years after behaviorism's formal founding in 1913. Conditioning methods were already in limited use, but Watson was largely responsible for their widespread application in American psychological research. Watson told psychologist Ernest Hilgard that his interest in conditioned reflexes grew out of his study of Bekhtierev's work, although he later gave credit to Pavlov as well. Watson described conditioning in terms of stimulus substitution. A response is conditioned when it becomes attached or connected to a stimulus other than the one that originally aroused it. With Pavlov's dogs, salivation to the sound of a bell instead of to the sight of food is a conditioned response. Watson chose this approach because it provided an objective method of analyzing behavior, of reducing it to its elementary units, the stimulus response, or SR bonds. Because all behavior could be reduced to these elements, the conditioned reflex method permitted psychologists to conduct laboratory investigations of complex human behaviors. Watson was continuing in the atomistic and mechanistic tradition established by the British empiricists and adopted by the structural psychologists. He intended to study human behavior in the same way the physical scientists were studying the universe, by breaking it down into its component parts, into its atoms and elements. And this goes all the way back to Descartes. And before Descartes, it goes all the way back to Aristotle. So this exclusive focus on objective methods, along with the elimination of introspection, meant a change in the nature and role of the human subject in the psychology laboratory. For Wundt and Titchener, subjects were both observer and observed because they observed their own conscious experience. Their role was clearly much more important than that of the experimenter. In behaviorism, the subjects themselves became less important. They no longer observed. Instead, they were observed by the experimenters. With this change in focus, the laboratory subjects, who used to be called observers, became commonly known as subjects. The true observers were the experimenters, the research psychologists who established the experimental conditions and recorded the subjects' responses. Thus, human subjects were demoted in status. They no longer actively observed their own characteristics. They merely behaved, and almost anyone can behave. Infants can behave, children can behave, people with mental and emotional disorders can behave, pigeons behave, or white laboratory rats behave. This viewpoint reinforced psychology's image of people as machines. As one historian notes, quote, "You put a stimulus in one of the slots and out comes a packet of reactions," end quote. The primary subject matter for Watson's behavioral psychology was the elements of behavior, that is, the body's muscular movements and glandular secretions. As the science of behavior, science could deal only with the acts or responses that could be described objectively without using any subjective or mentalistic terminology. A response, in Watson's view, could be as simple as a knee-jerk, but could also be more complex. Watson called these more complex responses acts. He considered response acts to include such events as eating, writing, dancing, or building a house. In other words, an act involves the organism's movement in space that accomplishes some goal that affects one's environment. All behavioral acts, no matter how complex, were capable of being reduced to lower-level motor or glandular responses. So every behavior has a goal intended. Responses can either be explicit or implicit. Explicit responses are overt and directly observable. Implicit responses, such as visceral movements, glandular secretions, and nerve impulses, occur inside the body. Although not overt, they are still considered to be behavior. By including implicit responses, Watson was modifying his requirement that all of psychology's data be actually observable. He accepted that some items of behavior could be potentially observable. The movements or responses that occur within the organism are observable through the use of instruments. Thus, in both methods and subject matter, Watson's behaviorism was an attempt to construct a science free of subjective notions and methods, a science as objective as physics. Let us consider how Watson treated these major topics: instincts, emotions, and thoughts. Like all systematic theorists, Watson developed his psychology in accordance with the underlying belief that all areas of behavior would be described in objective stimulus response terms, or SR terms. First, we will go over instincts. Second, we will go over emotions. And then after emotions, we will go over thoughts. Initially, Watson accepted the role of instincts in behavior. In his book Behavior, with the subtitle An Introduction to Comparative Psychology, published in 1914, he described 11 instincts, including one dealing with random behaviors. He had studied instinctive behavior in terms, a species of aquatic bird in the dry Tortugas Islands off the Florida coast. Accompanying him was Carl Lashley, his student at Hopkins. Lashley claimed that the expedition was cut short when they ran out of cigarettes and whiskey. By 1925, Watson revised his position and eliminated the concept of instinct. He argued that behaviors that seem instinctive are really socially conditioned responses. By adopting the view that learning or conditioning is the key to understanding or comprehending all human development, Watson became an extreme environmentalist. And then he went even further. Not only did he deny instincts, he refused to admit to his system any inherited capacities, temperaments, or talents of any kind. Behaviorism, or behaviors that seemed inherited, were actually the result of early childhood training. For example, he argued that children were not born with the ability to be great athletes or musicians, but were slanted in that direction by parents or caregivers who encouraged and reinforced the appropriate behaviors. This emphasis on the overwhelming nurturing effect of the parental and social environment was one reason for Watson's phenomenal public popularity. If you have to move my car, go ahead, just move my car. My key's in the door. He concluded simply and optimistically that children would be trained to be whatever one wanted them to be. There were no limitations imposed by genetic factors. Of course, Watson here is saying that mostly people are who they are basically by social conditioning, and culture more than they were by actual biology. So, Watson was not alone in suggesting that environmental influences were more important than any traits or potentials we might be born with biologically. It was already becoming popular within psychology to minimize the role of instincts as behavioral determinants. Thus, Watson's position reflected a shift in viewpoint already in progress. In addition, his stand may have been influenced by the applied orientation of early 20th century American psychology. Psychology would not be applied in ways to alter behavior unless it was accepted that behavior was capable of being changed. Behaviors governed by forces such as instincts could not be modified, whereas behaviors dependent on learning or training could. Concerning emotions, to Watson, emotions were nothing more than physiological responses to specific stimuli. Yeah, go ahead, move it. Move it.
I need to go. You need to move it.
I'm making a video, Dad. To Watson, emotions were nothing more than physiological responses to specific stimuli. A stimulus, such as a person suddenly threatening you with bodily harm, produces internal physical changes such as rapid heart rate along with the appropriate learned avert responses. This explanation for emotions denies any conscious perception of the emotion or the sensations from the internal organs. Each emotion involves a particular pattern of physiological changes. Although Watson noted that emotional responses do involve overt movements, he believed that the internal responses were predominant. Thus, emotion is a form of implicit behavior in which internal reactions are evident in physical manifestations, thus such as blushing, perspiration, or increased pulse rate. Watson's theory of emotions is less complex than that of William James. In James's theory, the bodily changes immediately followed the perception of the stimulus, and the feeling of those bodily changes was the emotion. Watson criticized James' position. Discarding the conscious process of perceiving the situation and the feeling state, Watson claimed that emotions could be described completely in terms of the objective stimulus situation, the overt bodily response, and the internal physiological changes. So, in a now classic study, Watson investigated the stimuli that produce emotional responses in infants. He suggested that infants showed three fundamental unlearned emotional response patterns: fear, rage, and love. Fear can be produced by loud noises and by sudden loss of support. Rage is produced by the restriction of bodily movements. Love is evoked by caressing the skin or by rocking and patting. Watson also found typical response patterns to these stimuli. All our other emotional responses are compounded from these basic emotions through the conditioning process, and they may become attached to stimuli that were not originally capable of eliciting them. So Watson demonstrated his theory of conditioned emotional responses in his study of little Albert, who was conditioned to fear a white rat, something he had not feared before the conditioning trials. From the single study with only one subject, Watson concluded that all adult fears, aversions, and anxieties likewise are conditioned in early childhood. They do not arise, as Freud claimed, from unconscious conflicts. Watson rejected the whole notion of the unconscious because, like consciousness, it could not be objectively observed. Initially, he was fascinated by many of Freud's concepts, but he eventually dismissed psychoanalysis as voodooism. Watson described the Albert research as preliminary, a pilot study only. It has never been successfully replicated. Although psychologists have since noted serious methodological flaws, the results of the Albert study have been accepted as scientific evidence and are cited in virtually every introductory psychology textbook. It has become too famous to ignore, however imperfect it may have been. Although Albert had been conditioned to fear white rats, rabbits, and Santa Claus masks, he was no longer available when Watson wanted to try to eliminate such unlearned fears. Not long after starting his research program, Watson left academics. Later, when working in advertising in New York, he gave a talk about his research, and the audience was Mary Covert Jones, a college classmate of his wife Rosalie. Watson's remarks sparked Jones's interest, and she wondered whether the conditioning technique would be used to remove children's fears. She asked Rosalie to introduce her to Watson, and then she undertook a study that has since become another classic in the history of psychology. Her subject in 1924 was a 3-year-old Peter, who already showed a fear of rabbits, although his fear had not been conditioned in the laboratory. While Peter was eating, a rabbit was brought into the room but kept at a distance, great enough so as not to trigger a fearful response. Over a series of trials lasting several weeks, the rabbit was brought progressively closer, always while the child was eating. Eventually, Peter got used to the rabbit and could touch it without showing any fear whatsoever. Generalized fear responses to similar objects were also eliminated by this procedure. Mary Covert Jones's study has been described as a precursor of behavior therapy, the application of learning principles to change maladaptive behavior, almost 50 years before the technique of behavior therapy became popular. Jones, long associated with the Institute of Child Welfare at the University of California, Berkeley, received the G. Stanley Hall Award in 1968 for her outstanding contributions to developmental psychology. The traditional view of thought processes was that they occurred in the brain, so faintly that no neural impulse passes over the motor nerve to the muscle, hence no response takes place in the muscles and glands. According to this theory, because thought processes occur in the absence of muscular movements, they could not be seen or experimented upon. Thought was regarded as intangible, something exclusively mental, that therefore had no physical reference points. Watson attempted to reduce thinking to implicit motor behavior. He argued that thought, like all other aspects of human functioning, was a type of sensory motor behavior. He reasoned that the behavior of thinking must involve implicit speech reactions or movements. Thus, he reduced thinking to subvocal talking that relies on the same muscular habits that we learn for overt speech. As we grow up, these muscular habits become inaudible and invisible because our parents and teachers frequently admonish us to stop talking aloud to ourselves. In this way, thinking becomes a way of talking silently. Watson suggested that the focal points for much of this implicit behavior are the muscles of the tongue and the larynx. So we also express thought through gestures, such as frowns and shrugs, which are overt reactions to stimuli. One obvious source of corroboration for Watson's theory is that Most of us are aware that we do talk to ourselves while we are thinking. A study of college students' introspective reports found that 73% of the thoughts sampled involved talking to themselves while they were thinking. This kind of evidence, however, is unacceptable to behaviorists precisely because it is introspective, and Watson could hardly depend on introspection to support his behavioral theory. Behaviorism required objective evidence of implicit speech movements, so he made experimental attempts to record tongue and larynx movements during thought. These measurements revealed slight movements some of the time the subjects were thinking. Measurements from the fingers and hands of hearing-impaired people using sign language also revealed movements some of the time during thought. Despite his inability to secure more reliable supportive results, Watson remained convinced of the existence of implicit speech movements. He insisted that their demonstration awaited only the development of more sophisticated laboratory equipment. Why did Watson's bold pronouncements win him such a large public following outside of psychology? Surely most people did not care that some psychologists pretended to be conscious while others claimed that psychology had lost its mind, or that some said thinking took place in the head and others voted for the neck. These issues aroused considerable comment among psychologists of that day, but they hardly concerned anyone else. What stirred the public was Watson's call for a new kind of society based on scientifically shaped and controlled behavior, free of all dogma, myths, and conventional ways of thinking. This approach offered hope to people disenchanted with old ideas that had been gone by the wayside. In fervor and faith, behaviorism took on aspects of a religion. Among the hundreds of articles and books written about Watson's behaviorism was The Religion Called Behaviorism by Berman in 1927, soon to be read by a 23-year-old B.F. Skinner, who wrote a review of the book and sent it to a popular literary magazine. Quote, "They did not publish my review, but in writing it, I was more or less defining myself for the first time as a behaviorist," said Skinner in 1976. B.F. Skinner would go on to refine and extend Watson's work, and we will talk about B.F. Skinner in a later reading. Some of the excitement generated by Watson's ideas is evident in the newspaper reviews of his book Behaviorism, written in 1925. The New York Times declared, quote, "It marks an epoch in the intellectual history of man," end quote. And that was in 1925. The New York Herald Tribune called it, quote, "the most important book ever written. One stands for an instant blinded with a great hope," end quote. The hope that stemmed from Watson's emphasis on the nurturing effect of the childhood environment in determining behavior and from his minimization of the impact of inherited tendencies. The following paragraph from Behaviorism is frequently quoted to support this point. Quote, "Give me a dozen healthy infants, well-formed in my own specified world to bring them up in, and I will guarantee to take anyone at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select. Doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant chief, and yes, even beggarman and thief, regardless of his talents, penchants, tendencies, abilities, vocations, and race of his ancestors," end quote. So Watson's conditioned reflex experiments, such as the Albert study, persuaded him that all emotional disturbances in adulthood are caused by conditioned responses established early on in infancy, childhood, and adolescence. If adult disturbances are a function of a faulty childhood conditioning, then a proper program of childhood conditioning should prevent the emergence of adult disorders. Watson believed this kind of practical control over childhood behavior and hence over the later adult behavior was not only possible, but absolutely necessary. He developed a plan for improving society, a program of experimental ethics based on the principles of behaviorism. No one gave him a dozen healthy infants so he could test his claim, and he later admitted that in making it he was going beyond the facts. However, he noted that people who disagreed with him and believed the impact of heredity was greater than that of the environment had been stating their case for thousands of years and still had no real evidence for their view. The following passage from Behaviorism shows the vitality, hope, and promise with which Watson described his program for better living under a behaviorist system. It may help us to appreciate why so many people adopted behaviorism as a new faith. quote, behaviorism ought to be a science that prepares men and women for understanding the principles of their own behavior. It ought to make men and women eager to rearrange their own lives and especially eager to prepare themselves to bring up their own children in a healthy way. I wish I could picture for you what a rich and wonderful individual we should make of every healthy child, if only we could let it shape itself properly and then provide for it a universe in which it could exercise that organization. A universe unshackled by legendary folklore or happenings thousands of years ago, unhampered by disgraceful political history, free of foolish customs and conventions which have no significance in themselves, yet which hem the individual in like taut steel bands. I am not asking here for revolution. I am not asking people to go out to some God-forsaken place, form a colony, go naked, and live a communal life. Nor am I asking for a change to a diet of roots and herbs. I am not asking for free love. I am trying to dangle a stimulus in front of you, a verbal stimulus which, if acted upon, will gradually change this universe. For the universe will change if you bring up your children not in the freedom of the libertine, but in the behavioristic freedom, a freedom which we cannot even picture in words, so little do we know of it. Will not these children in turn, with their better ways of living and thinking, replace us as a society and in turn bring up their children in a still more scientific way until the world finally becomes a place fit for human habitation? End quote. And that was Watson writing in 1930 from his book Behaviorism, page 303 and 304. Watson's plan to replace religion-based ethics was his experimental ethics based on behaviorism, and it remained only a hope and was never carried out. He outlined his program and left it as a framework for others. Years later, as we shall see, B.F. Skinner conceived in greater detail a scientifically shaped utopia in the spirit of Watson's ideas. By the 1920s, psychology had captured and captivated the public's attention. Given Watson's charisma, personal charm, persuasiveness, and message of hope, Americans were enthralled by what one writer called an outbreak of psychology. Much of the public was convinced that psychology provided the path to health, happiness, and prosperity. Psychological advice columns sprouted up in the pages of the daily newspapers. Psychologist Joseph Jastrow, who lived from 1863 to 1944, was once called, quote, the most prolific university-trained popular psychologist, end quote, in the United States during the 1920s and 1930s. He received his Ph.D. in 1886 from Johns Hopkins and pursued a lengthy academic career at the University of Wisconsin. He also wrote magazine articles about psychology, acting on his belief that the popularization of psychology was essential to its public appreciation and official support. Topics included curing the blues, the psychology of crooks, fears and worries, the meaning of intelligence quotient scores, inferiority complexes, family conflicts, and why we drink coffee. Now, obviously, psychology had come a long way from the laboratory work of Wundt and Titchener. Jastrow's newspaper column, Keeping Mentally Fit, was syndicated in 150 papers around the country, and he participated in nationwide radio programs such as Herald of Sanity and Women's Radio Review. He wrote a pop psychology manual, Piloting Your Life, with the subtitle, The Psychologist as Helmsman. Not unlike the self-help books perpetually on today's bestseller lists, his articles on the usefulness of psychology in everyday life appeared frequently in popular magazines such as Popular Science Monthly, Cosmopolitan, and Harper's. Again, his name was Joseph Jastrow. Another promoter of psychology was Albert Wiggum. Although not a psychologist, he wrote a popular newspaper column called Exploring Your Mind. Here is an example of the kind of thinking that he wrote in 1928. Men and women never needed psychology so much as they need it today. Young men and women need it in order to measure their own mental traits and capacities with a view to choosing their careers early and wisely. Businessmen need it to help them select employees. Parents and educators need it as an aid in rearing and educating children. All need it in order to secure the highest effectiveness and happiness. You cannot achieve these things in the fullest measure without the new knowledge of your own mind and personality that the psychologists have given us." End quote. The Canadian humorist Stephen Butler Leacock noted that psychology had once been safely confined to college campuses where it had no connection with reality and did no visible harm to anyone who studied it. But by 1924, however, psychology was everywhere. Leacock wrote, quote, "For almost every juncture of life, we now call in the services of an expert psychologist as naturally as we send for an emergency plumber. In all our great cities, there are already, or soon will be, signs that read, quote, 'Psychologist, open all day and night,' end quote." Thus was psychology welcomed throughout the United States, and John B. Watson may have done more than any other individual to help it spread. So in a sense, I guess it was because of Watson's that Watson was kicked out of academia and he had to enter the real world, that it was the way in which his actual views became popular among many Americans at the time. So now we go to a small note on the criticisms of Watson's behaviorism. So as any system that proposes sweeping revisions blatantly attacks the existing order and suggests that the earlier version of the truth be discarded is sure to be criticized, and it ought to be. We know that American psychology was already moving toward greater objectivity when Watson founded behaviorism, but not all psychologists were ready to accept the extreme objectivity that Watson proposed. Many psychologists, including some who supported the general principle of objectivity, believed that Watson's program omitted important components such as sensory and perceptual processes. Carl Lashley, who was born in 1890 and died in 1958, Lashley was a student of Watson's at Johns Hopkins University, where he earned his PhD. His career as a physiological psychologist took him to the universities of Minnesota and Chicago, to Harvard, and finally to the Yerkes Laboratory of Primate Biology. He upheld the mechanistic tradition that had characterized psychology since its founding. Lashley revealed that as a boy he was as baffled by people as he was skillful with mechanisets. Mechanisets were toys for making mechanical construction such as buildings and bridges. Psychology finally felt open to him, he said, when he recognized that human beings and machines had a great deal in common. Lashley was an advocate of Watson's behaviorism, though his research on brain mechanisms in rats challenged one of Watson's basic points. Lashley summarized his findings in Brain Mechanisms and Intelligence, written in 1929. He offered two now famous principles, the first being the law of mass action, which states that the efficiency of learning is a function of the intact mass of the cortex. The more cortical tissue available, the better the learning. And so again, that means that the efficiency of learning is a function of the intact mass of the cortex. The more cortical tissue available, the better the learning. And so that's the efficiency of learning is a function of the total mass of cortical tissue. He also said that another principle, which is the principle of equipotentiality. Equipotentiality, which states that one part of the cortex is essentially equal to another in terms of its contribution to learning. One part of the cerebral cortex is essentially equal to another in its contribution to learning, which states both of those, the law of mass action and equipotentiality, are two principles concerning learning. Lashley expected his research to lead him to specific sensory and motor centers in the cerebral cortex, as well as corresponding connections between sensory and motor apparatus. Such findings would have supported the primacy and simplicity of the reflex arc as an elemental unit of behavior. What happened, however, was that his results challenged Watson's idea of a simple point-to-point connection in reflexes, according to which the brain serves merely to switch incoming sensory nerve impulses into outgoing motor impulses. Lashley's findings suggested that the brain plays a more active role in learning than Watson could accept. Thus, Lashley contested Watson's assumption that behavior is compounded bit by bit solely through conditioned reflexes. Although Lashley's work discredited a fundamental part of Watson's system, it did not weaken the behaviorist insistence on objective research methods. On the contrary, Lashley's work confirmed the value of objective methods in psychological research. So, contributions of Watson's behaviorism. Watson's productive career in psychology lasted fewer than 20 years, but he profoundly affected the course of psychology's development for many years to come. He was an effective agent of the times that were changing not only in psychology, but in general scientific attitudes as well. The 19th century had witnessed magnificent advances in every branch of science. The 20th century promised even more marvels. It was thought that scientists, if given enough time, would find solutions to every problem, answers to every question. Watson made psychology more objective in methods and terminology. Although his positions on specific topics stimulated much research, his original formulations are no longer useful. So he did make psychology more objective in its methods and terminology. As a distinct school of thought, Watsonian behaviorism was replaced by other forms of psychological objectivism that built upon it, as we will see later, by the works of B.F. Skinner. The historian E.G. Boring said in 1929 that behaviorism was already past its prime. Because revolutionary movements depend on protest for their strength, it was a very effective tribute to Watson's behaviorism to proclaim, just 16 years after its introduction, that it no longer needed to protest simply because there was nothing left to protest against. Watson's behaviorism effectively overcame the earlier mainstream positions in psychology. A graduate student at the University of Wisconsin in 1926 reported that by then few students had heard of Wundt and Titchener. Objective methods and language had become identified with American psychology, and so Watson's system died, as have other successful movements in psychology, by being absorbed into the main body of thought to provide a strong conceptual base for modern psychology. Although Watson's program did not realize its ambitious goals, he is widely recognized for his founding role. The centennial of his birth was celebrated in April of 1979, the same year as the centennial birth of psychology as a science. A symposium at Furman University, where the psychology laboratory is named for Watson, drew psychologists from throughout the United States. One speaker there was B.F. Skinner, whose talk was titled, What J.B. Watson Meant to Me. Hometown residents remembered Watson somewhat less favorably. Many recalled him as an upstart and an atheist who had turned his back on his Southern heritage and Baptist upbringing. In 1984, a commemorative marker was placed on the highway near his birthplace, an unusual honor for a psychologist. To some degree, the acceptance of Watsonian behaviorism was a function of Watson's personality. A charismatic figure, he projected his ideas with enthusiasm, optimism, and self-confidence. He was a strong, appealing speaker who scorned tradition and rejected the current psychology. These personal qualities, plus the spirit of the times he so ably manipulated, define him as one of psychology's pioneers.